In this video, we'll look at the useContext hook, which allows you to conveniently replace context consumer components with hooks in function components. The Context API is an incredible way to share global data with deeply nested components. You begin by using the createContext function to instantiate a context, which then allows you to create provider and consumer components. These provider components act like sources of data for all child components downstream in the hierarchy. Thereafter, within any of these child components, we can create consumer components to bring in this data directly from the context for consumption. While this is great, you can sometimes end up in a situation referred to as wrapper hell, where multiple consumer components are nested, as you can see here. When working with function components, we can avoid this situation and in fact completely do away with context consumer components by using the useContext hook. Let's see this in action. Begin by downloading and setting up the project from the link given on the screen, and as always, fire up the development server. Our app here renders a dashboard interface for an air monitoring system. So you have an air quality score along with the text description of the status, and you also have the logged in user's name as well as their last logged in timestamp. At the top, we also have theme buttons which let you dynamically switch the theme from this light mode to a dark mode and this colored mode as well. All of this data, the theme, the air quality stats, and the logged in user's info, is being consumed using the Context API already. You can see I have 3 instances of the context set up here for the theme, user data, as well as the air quality stats. Inside these files, we are simply invoking createContext to instantiate a new and unique context for logical separation of data. Our data is a static data set here. In a production use case, you might want to use the useEffect hook to pull in this data from an API. Down here, we are rendering a container div within which we are just rendering a dashboard component which is nested within multiple context providers to enable child components to consume all this data without implementing forwarding props all the way. Besides the dashboard, we also have a theme picker component that passes up these simple CSS rules for our contrived example based on the button that you click on the UI. And this is what we are setting in the theme state variable, which in turn pushes this data into the theme context provider down here. If we go into the dashboard component, we can see the consumer component for the theme context in use. We are receiving the theme styles and we are setting it to the dashboard div right here. On the other hand, the user component, which renders the user data, uses the user context consumer component to access the name and last logged timestamp from the context. Lastly, our stats component ingests air quality stats data from the stats context consumer, as you can see here. This particular example doesn't implement nested consumers, but we can still simplify the consumption of context data using the useContext hook. So let's begin with the dashboard component. I'll bring in the useContext hook first. Then we'll just extract the theme object from useContext, where we'll set the theme CTX as the argument. That's it. We no longer need the nesting complexities of the context consumer component and its render props. Wasn't that amazingly simple? If your component needed data from more than one context provider, you can simply use multiple instances of useContext to extract the data and use it directly in the component. This is not only simple to understand, it also makes your components simpler and reduces component nesting to a huge extent. And everything works as expected. Let's now go into the user component and we'll once again implement the useContext hook, where we'll extract the name and last logged timestamp data from the user CTX context. Simple, isn't it? One last component to go. let's detangle the stats component as well in the same way. Here, we'll extract the AQI and AQ text values from the stats CTX context. And everything works well, and our code base is now more readable as well. While you still have to implement context provider components when working with consumers in function components, the useContext hook literally saves you from writing context consumer components and makes your code look beautiful, clean, and simple to understand. This functionality is a bit like the context type property that we get with class components, which lets you plug in a context provider for accessing context data directly within the component. But the beauty of the useContext hook is that you can create multiple instances that allow you to access data from multiple context providers upstream using a simple syntax. In the next video, we'll investigate the useReducer hook.